So in terms of our craft of writing, the most common form that you're going to be asked to do, and you have been asked to do, is the narrative. And now narrative, as we know, has some reasonably simplistic ways to unpack in terms of orientation, in terms of complication and resolution, the old style of teaching the text type. And that's all well and good, but what it doesn't do is it doesn't unpack the devices and the techniques that great writers employ to actually cause you to become a better, more sophisticated and more engaged and interesting writer. Now, the first thing I recommend you do, and I've put a copy of this onto Canvas LMS for you to have a look at, is if you just type in literary devices into a Google search. You've got literary devices terms. There's so many different little bits and pieces where you can start to unpack what each of these possibly are or what they even mean. Or even type in narrative devices. And honestly, you get a reasonably good Wikipedia page that has this list, and the list has examples, and they're very well described and unpacked. And so you can think about how each of those work in your own writing, in text, and in concept and idea. Most importantly, you have style there, but most importantly, you get sort of areas which are just the idea of how to create types of writing. Perspective, this one here, which is great. Things that happen in plots. What a wonderful little category, because it's not just telling us the different types of story, but different things you can do inside of a plot. And so that's a really, really good section to have a look at. What I want you to do, of course, is unpack that from the page that I've put up on the LMS for you, which is great. That this video is really the second half of the lesson I did today, where we're interested in unpacking what's going on narratively in terms of parts of metamorphosis, or the metamorphosis. We know in part one that we've dealt with the sequences for Grigor having become this creature. We know that we're dealing with elements of modernism. We know we're dealing with elements of alienation. But of course, it's easy for us to say, but how do we know that? What is going on in the actual narrative that shows us that this is what Kafka is completely in control of? And the first thing I wanted to point out, the first thing to me that matters, is this particular moment. Now, this sentence here, under this point here, I've still got an arrow, but that sentence there, however it's written for you, is exceptionally important. It was only when he reached the door that he realised what it actually was that had drawn him over to it. It was the smell of something to eat. You have a simple concept in there. Humans must sustain themselves. People must eat. People must sleep. People must work. People must breathe. People must drink. These things are given for our sustainability. But the same goes for the creature, the animal of whom we are, or what we are, as it were. So, in order to understand what's happening here, we understand that there has been a transformation in the way Gregor is as a character. Not just as Gregor is interested in this or that, but as a character, he has fundamentally transformed. And the language tells us that. It says it was only when he'd done something that a realization occurs to him that he was hungry, and he was led by his sense of smell. This is an entirely new experience under or considering the human condition. So what it means for us is that Gregor's way of characterization has changed. The narrator is now moving into that element of surprise. He no longer has desire or focus in the way a human does. A human thinks first and acts. A creature acts and then thinks. So he has removed what it means to be fundamentally human. And by doing that, it shows us what it means to be fundamentally human in the modern sense. By the door there was a dish filled with sweetened milk, with little pieces of white bread floating in it. He was so pleased he almost laughed, as he was even hungrier than he had been that morning, and immediately dipped his head into the milk, nearly covering his eyes with it. But he soon drew his head back, again in disappointment. Not only did the pain in his tender left side make it difficult to eat the food, he was only able to eat if his whole body worked together as a snuffling hole, and the milk did not taste at all nice. Milk like this was normally his favourite drink, and his sister had certainly left it there for him because of that. But he turned almost against his own will away from the dish and crawled back into the centre of the room. Now, there's a lot going on in that particular paragraph, or at least the rest of that paragraph. So let's think about that for a moment. We have to unpack a few things. Firstly, pleasure. I'll redo those, they're terrible. So this particular paragraph has some very key moments when we're thinking about unpacking narrative and how this writer works. And if you're emulating Kafka or thinking about what Kafka does in terms of narration and writing, it's here we can unpack some of the key moments. Pleasure. He was so pleased, he almost laughed. Great emotion, hyperbolic to a point where he then draws himself back, and we realise the pleasure is linked to hunger. So we understand that emotion is linked to function. That is quite a modern writing way of working. Emotions are no longer flippant. They are functional parts of the human condition. He moves to the milk and he drinks it with relish, or he feels that he needs to do that. And then he of course finds that the milk is not to his liking. The milk did not taste at all nice. Milk like this was normally his favourite drink, and his sister had certainly left it there for him because of that. His sister is familiar with his way of being. She is familiar with what he likes. Therefore, she is familiar with his character. This fundamental change in him is highlighted by the fact that both of them get it wrong. That both of them don't realise that his cockroach self now requires a different type of sustenance. The author or narrator gives a sense that they're aware that this is the case, and the reader should already have made that conclusion. Hence we understand that the character in the story, the narrator in the story, and the reader of a story are three separate entities that shape and create the meaning in a story through the way things have been written. The last thing I want to unpack in this particular paragraph is the word crawled. Crawled. The language around Gregor has changed and transformed as well. His movements are now bug and insect-like and are no longer like that of a human. His desire to eat hasn't changed. What he eats has. So think about creating a character not just through physical description, but by what they might eat, by when and how they eat, who they are when they eat. This is definitive and often overlooked in student writing. A meal can be a transformative event in a story, and it should be. There's examples of that everywhere, from Macbeth to this particular text, to the first meal that Harry Potter has at Hogwarts, which is presented to him in that magical way. It goes on, and we get another issue where Gregor no longer has that human way of being. It was not until later at night that the gaslight in the living room was put out, and now it was easy to see that his parents and sister had stayed awake all that time, as they could be distinctly heard as they went together on tiptoe. It was clear that no one would come into Gregor's room any more until morning. That gave him plenty of time to think undisturbed about how he would have to rearrange his life. Now he's starting to get it. For some reason, the tall, empty room he was forced to remain made him feel uneasy as he lay there flat on the floor. Now, that again is interesting because of this phrase, for some reason. For some reason. So the narrator is as unsure as Gregor, but the reader probably already knows why. The tall empty room makes him feel uneasy, and he lay there flat on the floor because he's a cockroach. But it seems to be the case that the narrator and Gregor still are coming to terms with this, coming to grips with this in the writing. This creates tension and unease in the style. Hardly aware of what he was doing other than a slight feeling of shame, he hurried under the couch, pressed down on his back, and then he was fine. In no way is that a human thing to do. His behaviour is no longer that of the human being. So there's tiny little aspects of the writing that you can find and highlight and unpack, show you how narration, narrative and story can work at this point. We will continue to unpack this as we go.